Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Now, I know that you are a little bit uncomfortable with the title of the podcast, and I just wanted to address that first of all. And I fully understand your concerns and what they might be around that. And I really appreciate you still making the decision to come onto the podcast and talk to me today.
Thanks, Kaya. Yes, I'm glad I'm doing it. As you know, I did struggle a little bit because of the title of the podcast, although I appreciate that that's quite a personal thing for me, for most people. That well-known saying of what doesn't kill you make you stronger doesn't have that strong reaction. And I think your podcast series is wonderful in showing that things that we might think are unsurvivable, we can overcome. But some things are not, and sadly depression is something that does kill people, and hopefully the more that we can do to raise awareness of that, the more as a society we can find ways of helping reduce the number of suicides.
And it is still one of the biggest taboos within society, isn't it? And you are doing amazing work, and you are really helping to try and break that taboo, having not only experienced it once but twice.
Yeah, I think there is still some element of stigma around suicide, not as much as there was 30 years ago, but there is still some stigma. But that stigma in itself contributes to the prevalence of suicide. But I think the more that we can talk about it, bring it out into the open, show that it affects people across all society. Mainly, there are certainly more men that die from suicide, but it is an issue with women as well. It's becoming an even greater issue with younger people. But if we can show that this can affect anyone and everyone, is not something that we can put in a box and be comfortable and say, well, that would only happen to that type of person, it wouldn't affect me. So the more that we can talk about it, and for me it's about encouraging people to reach out and get help at a very early stage. It's like cancer. If you don't go for diagnosis and treatment when you have cancer at an early stage, it may be too late. And I believe it's the same with depression and other mental health issues.
Now, in terms of your story, your experiences, if I can just sort of take you back more than 30 years, really, isn't it? You were married quite young and had a young family. What was life like for you in the early stages of your marriage?
I think it's fair to say that life was always quite difficult. Brian had a number of issues from when he was a teenager, and and they really hadn't been addressed, and they came into our marriage, and we were both very young, so we weren't emotionally equipped, I don't think, to manage it. And then we had a young family very quickly. We moved down south in early days and lived in quite an isolated farm for a number of years. We'd very, very little money, and we did have some good times, but life was very difficult, quite isolated. And when I look back, I think that Brian would have been diagnosed with depression nowadays, but not even that word, there was no inkling of it at all. So life was very difficult, and society and family life was different then as well. You were grown up, you were married, you had a family, you were much more a sense of being on your own, and having to, the phrase "make your bed and lie in it," that is a phrase that people sort of believed back then. So life was very different, and I do, when I look back and think, had there been more support around us, perhaps things would have been different, but that's with hindsight.
And when, after he had taken his own life, what support was there available for you and for the children? What support were you able to receive?
Again, I think in those days there wasn't really a support framework for people. I also think I probably, I've always been a very independent person, so I probably wasn't very good at looking for help. But, very much I sort of just packed it all away so I didn't have to think about it and focused on looking after my 4 children and working and trying to do the best for them. And, 4 young children is physically very tiring and takes up an awful lot of time, so it doesn't leave a lot of time for anything else. The children weren't given a explanation of what had happened other than their dad had died. We deemed them too young, and again, I don't think professionally we'd have had the resources to help them at that time. So it became something that really wasn't spoken about, that was a gap in their lives that they didn't have, I think, a context to place it in. And it wasn't until they were quite a bit older, quite a few years later, before I felt that they would have to know what had happened, and I needed some professional help in doing that. And did get some help, professional help, to tell them the circumstances. But again, I think probably 30 years ago we weren't as knowledgeable about helping children then, and I don't think that what the help that was provided was necessarily a positive for them. So it was all quite difficult, to be honest.
Yeah, and after sort of particularly focusing on Gordon, like, you had the 4 children, but after they had started to receive some of this professional help and they'd actually been told what had happened, did you start to see a change in Gordon at all? How did he kind of process? How did he respond to actually that knowledge of what had really happened to his dad?
Yeah. I think he found it very confusing. I think it's fair to say too, Gordon was my lovely, loving, affectionate, boisterous, pretty mischievous handful. He was a handful. And I would say right from when he was very young, he found life more challenging than his siblings did. They did well at school. He struggled at school. He was boisterous and reckless and fearless, and so often ended up in scrapes or hospital or in trouble because of that. He just didn't think things through. And I think he found processing and understanding things more difficult. So I felt that he was more confused and more upset by it.
And as he got older, he decided to join the army. Didn't he? Signed up to be a soldier. Were you happy about that when you'd found out about his chosen path?
Oh yeah, he'd wanted to be a soldier from when he was a little boy. I'd take them through to Edinburgh on days out, and he used to look and stand for ages in front of the soldiers in Edinburgh Castle and say, I'm going to be one of those one day. And actually, not only was he in that regiment, but he led the Queen's Guard at Edinburgh Castle just a few years ago, which was such a proud moment and a huge achievement for him. He'd had very troubled teenage years as well. That struggle, as I say, is the only way I can explain it. Life was just more of a struggle for him. And he had difficult teenage years. Then when he actually had his first daughter, he was only 17 when Leah was born, and he was a wonderful father to her, doted on her right from the start. But that was the moment, the thing that changed it for him. He's like, I want to do my best for her. I want to make her proud, and so he pursued his dream of joining the army at that point. So I was thrilled. I was a very proud mum at his first passing out when he got the most improved recruit, but he was furious about that because he didn't want to be the most improved. He wanted to be the best. And when he completed his training and did his final passing out, he did get awarded the best recruit award then. So yeah, I was a very proud mum. He'd achieved a lot, and he went on to have a very successful career in the army, achieving lots of things: colonel's commendations, champion boxer awards, awards for coaching and bringing on younger boxers and soldiers, and he was very loved and respected in the army.
How much, I mean, you touched on the boxing there. How much do you think, I mean, he was very much into his sport, wasn't he? But boxing was really his thing. How much do you think sport and the boxing helped him to sort of focus and to maybe get out some of those struggles and some of those negative thoughts and to kind of use sport in that way?
I think it always did, and right from when he was a young child, he was a really good swimmer. And again, he had so much energy. So I used to leave him thrashing up and down the pool while I took the others in to get dried and changed, and he'd still be going up and down the pool. So he was always into sport, and the boxing again was a good focus for him. And also, I think it's not a coincidence. I mean, he was a PT instructor in the army as well. So he was very physically active, and that was good for him. I think it's not a coincidence that he'd had 2 bouts of pneumonia, which really affected his physical fitness and his ability to do what he used to do. And I think that was one of the many factors that contributed to what happened, because he wasn't able to do the amount of physical activity that he'd been doing. He was desperately trying to get his fitness back and be who he'd been.
And when did you start to notice that he wasn't maybe coping as well as he should have been, as you had hoped he would be?
It started to become apparent about a year before he died. So he started, could see he just wasn't himself. It was a very up and down pattern. And although I was aware of that at the time, because I was going up and down with him, like, you'd think, oh, yeah, he's back to himself. He's having fun. He's doing things. He's feeling good. And then he would be down again. So when I look back, particularly looking at all our messages, that sort of roller coaster effect is very, very apparent. And I think it's because in a lot of ways he was trying to do it himself in his own strength. So he was trying to force himself to be better, where you can only sustain that for a little while and then he would go down again. And both myself and his wife pleaded with him to get help, to seek professional help, to admit that he wasn't well. And he would not do that for a long time, because he, whether incorrectly or not, he believed that would affect his army career. He thought it would end his army career. He couldn't face the thought of life without his beloved army. So it was a long while before it got to the point where he was so bad that there really was no choice. And I remember saying to him one day, I said, Gordon, you have to get help. You have to go and seek help, because even if it affects your army career, if you don't do anything, you're not going to have your job. You're not going to have your wife. You're not going to have your children. You cannot. You can't go on like this. And he did go and get help. The army try to do, as they've got a lot in place to support people, but I think what they haven't found a way to overcome yet is that stigma that people in the army feel about trying to access the support that's there. Gordon's doctor in the army was lovely. He was he was a friend of Gordon's. He was very supportive of him. He was incredibly supportive of us as a family. afterwards. But at the same time, I do wonder what would have happened if Gordon had actually got referred for more specialist help. He was put on antidepressants. He was diagnosed with a severe clinical depression. He was put on antidepressants. He wasn't very good at taking them, and that didn't help.
Is that because as he started to take them, he would then start to feel better and see the benefits of them, so then think he wouldn't need them?
Yeah, and also when he wasn't great, you know, as I said to myself, he got very confused. He would feel very confused and muddled and not have the energy to do anything. And probably, you know, so either he was feeling great and didn't think he needed them, or he was feeling really bad and couldn't bring himself to. So that he wasn't very good at managing it himself, but he was so severely ill by that time. And so I think it's very difficult. I think people struggling do not have access to the right sort of professional support, and you know, we have, I think, to do more to address mental health issues, because you know, there's other. I mean, I have a friend who lost his son recently, and his son was on a 6-month waiting list for mental health specialist support. If somebody does go to the doctor with early symptoms of cancer, they will be seen within 2 weeks. But we don't do that with mental health issues, and they can be fatal too. They can be terminal as well. Yeah. You know, as a society, I think we can still perceive people who take their own lives to have been weak. You know, and my son was very strong. He'd achieved a lot. He'd overcome a lot. He was an excellent soldier. You know, he was a strong person. But I also think that anything that's too strong and too rigid can break. You know, that's why trees bend, so that they can flex. So, you know, I think in a culture like the Irish, where you have to be strong, that can create problems in itself. You know, Gordon was absolutely, you know, probably the king of banter in his regiment. And so I think banter is something that can absolutely mask what's going on underneath the surface. Gordon's colleagues used to laugh because they said Gordon could get away with saying anything to anybody. He was very well known in the regiment because of his boxing and setting up the boxing team and training them. And he was very funny. You know, he was funny. He did brilliant. Quite often he would do sort of the speaking slots when they were having mess do's, and he was really, really good. A brilliant orator, raconteur, very funny. But, you know, that was an excellent shield for him to hide behind. When I speak to quite a number of other bereaved parents now as well, and we often find that when we're discussing particularly our sons, we're discussing the same characteristics. They were always a joker, they were funny, they were caring, they were loving, they were affectionate, and underneath it all they were very sensitive, but they hid it. And it made it difficult for them to ask for help. And Gordon had just gone back to work before we lost him, and it was a difficult decision at the time. I think it was difficult for the doctor to decide whether to allow him to go back to work. His wife and I talked about it, and I talked about it with Gordon, because on the one hand, he felt going back to work might help him, because just being, you know, at home during a day on his own probably wasn't good. But then I think he wasn't equipped and strong enough to cope with some of the situations that occurred.
Yeah. So how long had he been off work, sort of prior to going back?
Do you know, I can't actually remember. Maybe a month or so. It's a bit of a blur. But he'd been signed off, and he didn't want to be signed off work. And then he wanted to go back. And the doctor did take the step of talking to his chain of command and to the colonel and the majors, and saying that he still had concerns about Gordon, that he was high risk, and that should they notice anything untoward or out of, that they were to let him know. So there was a high level of concern around his mental health, even when he went back to work. And it was literally, very short time afterwards that we lost him.
And there is research that shows that those who have experienced suicide of a loved one are actually more at risk themselves. Were you as a family aware of that research? Were you aware that was, because to those, speaking as somebody who hasn't experienced that, it strikes me as almost counterintuitive in a sense that actually somebody who has seen the impact that suicide has had would not want to go down that route. And I'm trying to use my words really carefully, because
I know what you mean. It's really hard. It's really hard to understand. Your rational thinking would be that having seen, and Gordon himself said it when he signed up for the Marathon in 2019, he said, I am 35, I have been to 3 funerals as a result of suicide, and I want to do all I can to stop this gut-wrenching heartache. Word for word, that's what he said. But I think the risk is something like 10 times higher, and I'll be honest, it always frightened me. I lived in fear because I knew that my children were at a higher risk of suicide because their father had taken his own life. I don't know what it is in research, even people that do research can't say what it is. I think it's more that it becomes part of your experience. So people who have been bereaved by suicide, it's something that's there in their experience, and so it's more likely to come into their mind. But that's just what I think. And I did live in fear, and I did think, and indeed I'd said it to Gordon, because we had conversations about, the risk of him taking his life. He, on several occasions, assured me he wouldn't, said I'd never get that call, and he wouldn't do it, and he wanted to be with his kids, and he wanted to see his grandkids. On other occasions, he would say he was struggling and coming close to it. And I didn't think I could survive it. I really thought of losing a child because, like every day, I think I love my children more than anybody else loves their children. And the thought of losing, whenever I heard about anybody losing a child, I would just think, oh no, I couldn't survive that. And which takes us to your title, really, because I am surviving it. Yeah. I've had to work really hard to do that. I've had to focus on a initially minute by minute basis, and then day by day ways of coping and getting through it, because part of me will just always be in a heap on the floor screaming, but I have other children and grandchildren, and I need to not lose out on the joy that they bring me as well. And it does help me. It's hard to talk about things like this. It's hard to go public, but I think unless more of us can do so that people see suicide can affect anybody and everyone at any time. We can't ignore it on the grounds it's not going to happen to us, that it's not going to be somebody we know. There will be people in your close circle of friends and in your family who have suicidal thoughts. It happens to, wonderful people, to good people, to across all types of society. It is not something we can pigeonhole. And I think we need that awareness of this is a massive problem. We are losing so many lives, so many valuable lives being lost, and the impact is really wide on families and friends and future generations. It's something that I do think as society we have to now take very, very seriously and address in a different way.
And I mean, within Gordon's world, he was so aware of it, wasn't he? Because not only of what had happened to his own father, but also, like you said, he'd been to the funerals of close friends.
Yeah.
What impact do you think that had sort of had on him, actually seeing, having to attend and lay to rest close friends that he'd served alongside?
Very distressed. But again, he thought, and I thought, that because that again just brought it home how dreadful it was, and he did want to save people from that. That it meant it was less likely to happen to him. But again, I do think, in particular, he'd had a close colleague who'd, when they were in Iraq, Gordon at that time was a corporal, and he had another friend who was the sergeant, and then another friend who was the trooper who was the driver. So the three of them in the tank or whatever were very, very close. And the younger one who'd been the driver took his own life only a few weeks before Gordon, and Gordon was devastated and traumatised by that. But I think it meant when he was himself in a down state and struggling and couldn't, as he said to me, my thoughts get confused and go round and round like a washing machine and I can't see a way out. I think maybe that recollection, because he chose the same way to end his life. And I think it was just there and very recent and therefore came into his mind perhaps more easily.
What was it like for you, though, when you got that call to say what had happened to Gordon?
Horrific. Unbearable. I was just screaming, don't let it have happened. It was just, indescribable. And, nothing will ever be the same again. But, I feel that it's important to me and part of my honouring of Gordon to live my life as best I can and to get as much joy out of it and to help others. But it's not something I would wish on anybody, and it's terrible. There are so many bereaved parents out there, and I think no matter what the circumstances a parent loses their child in, it's horrific. I think where it's suicide, there is another layer of dreadfulness that is very difficult to cope with, and people, will go over and over what had happened. They feel guilty. They, think what if and if only, and it's very, very hard to come to an acceptance of your child not just dying but having taken their life. And yet there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of parents going through that at the time, and on the communities I'm on, years and years later, it's still the same. So, and I think the pain is still the same. You can learn to live with it. I feel I have to try, and I've made changes in my life to accommodate this grief that I have and try and not let it overwhelm me and take away everything else that is good in my life.
And you said to me before we started recording that you don't believe that he wanted to die. You don't believe that he really wanted to end it.
No, and I don't think anybody does. I don't think that they want to die. They just have got to a point where they need an end to the pain and despair and turmoil that they are experiencing. But Gordon told me many times how much he wanted to live. And so, it's very hard. And when we talk about people choosing to take their own life, I don't think that's a good way to phrase it. I don't think it's a choice any more than people choose to die from cancer. They've got an illness, it gets unbearable, and sometimes they just can't find a way out of it. And, Gordon's doctor said to me, he said, I can't save everyone on the battlefield, and I can't save everybody that has mental health issues.
How can you channel your grief in order to be able to help other families, to be able to help other bereaved parents, to be able to help Gordon's wife through what she and her children are now going through your own experiences?
I think it's something you just have to find your way, sort of, you're fumbling through trying to find what makes it possible for you to get from minute to minute at the beginning. And I think, it's also a very individual thing. So the way that I cope with my grief will not necessarily work for other people. So I think you have to find out, for yourself. I think I'm also very fortunate that I do have a strong faith. So I believe that I will be reunited with Gordon at some time in the future. That does not make living without him in my life here and seeing his children growing up without him and seeing the impact on his siblings doesn't make any of that less painful and terrible. But I have got that belief that I will see him again, which, it has really been important to me and helping me get off the floor, to be honest. I found it helped me to write. I'd never done writing since I was a little girl in primary school, but the night before the funeral, I was particularly dreading the crematorium. I felt I really, really would have struggled with that, and I woke up and sort of I'd managed to get some sleep. Woke up and got up and wrote a poem called Goodbye My Son, and in the morning I sent it to his wife and to the padre, who was, remains a wonderful support, and I said, if appropriate, could you perhaps read this? And he read it at the crematorium at the last moments, and and that really helped me. So I didn't deliberately sit down to write poems or stories, but I found it very therapeutic to write, and things would just come to me, and then I would write it, so I was writing kind of all the time to begin with, and now I don't write all the time, and I think that's because I am getting better at coping and able to do other things as well. But for me, that was something that just writing down feelings, writing down things that I came across that were helpful to me. I got postcards and inspirational cards, and in the back of them I would write things I'd read in some of the books that I read, some helpful books that I read. Dying to be Free was one of them, and An Unspeakable Loss, about the loss of a child. So I would write bits of them, some Bible verses, some of Gordon's messages to me, because when I was feeling, because you do feel, I thought my love was enough. I thought it would be enough. And so you feel that you have let your child down. So having excerpts from Gordon's messages where he said, you're just the best mum, I wouldn't be able to be getting through this without you, and writing that down. And then when I was getting in a state, to be honest, when my grief would be absolutely overwhelming, I would get out all these cards and just read out loud to myself the things that I'd written down, the messages, the inspiration, Gordon's, and just read them over and over and over out loud until I could breathe again calmly. And so, that was something, and I carry them around with me and still use them and jot down new things. And then one of the things I'd written, it was just around the time of Caroline Flack's suicide, actually, and I was just so distressed. I'm thinking, there's yet another person that has taken their own life, and it can be celebrities or unknown people, but it's just so prevalent. And I'd written this words to just reach out, which were expressing my desire for people to reach out and get help. And it says, you're loved and needed here, and you leave a space no one can fill. So I'd written all that down, and then I haven't got time for that story, but I'd then come into contact with a Glasgow busker who's just absolutely lovely, and that's a different story in itself.
Because you've now managed to record that, haven't you, as a song and release it to try and help others and to help get that message through.
And it's had so many thousands of views, and we hope it's helping people, and anybody who downloads it, the money goes to the Samaritans as well. So that was a chance meeting that became a hugely important factor in my getting from one day to the next, because we did the song. Liam wrote the most beautiful music for it. He sings it amazingly. Struan filmed it. We released it last year this time last year on the anniversary of Gordon's death, and so that gave me a really strong focus. And knowing that thousands and thousands of people were hearing that, just think, well, if it helps one person. And actually, on the first time when we did the sort of soft release of it on Facebook, one of the first messages was from a girl who said, "I was meant to see this tonight." And you just think, well, if it helps one. And then moving on from Just Reach, because of Just Reach Out, I've done other radio interviews and articles, and so if I did nothing, Gordon would still not be with me. I can't bring him back, much as I want to. Nothing will, the cost would always be too high of anything good that comes out of it. But, for me, feeling that I'm doing something that is raising awareness that might be preventing other mums from going through what I'm going through is a positive legacy for Gordon. It's in keeping with him, his desire to help other people. So I could do nothing and he would still not be here, or I can do the things I do and he's still not here, but maybe some other people are, and that's got to be better.
Yeah. And it is approaching the second anniversary. How are the rest of his siblings, and how will you mark that anniversary? It's
had a big impact on all of his siblings, all of them in very different ways, and that's to be expected. We all grieve, and grief is different for everybody. With some of his siblings, we talk more about it than with others. Everybody's, and I've got to, I just want what's best for them and respect what's best for them. We found a very special place in Loch Lomond, which is where Gordon had wanted his ashes to be spread. Because he was in the army, he had to have made these things known. So it was helpful to know that we were doing what he wanted. So when that's where we scattered his ashes, which was incredibly difficult. But it's given us a lovely place that we go back to as a family, and so that's what we'll be doing. And it just feels like it's the most beautiful place.
How much do you worry about your other children?
I do worry. I know worry about Gordon's children, and it's very difficult to live with that fear.
Now, a lot of the work, like you say, with the song that you have done and your fundraising is focused around the Samaritans. Sorry. with a lot of the work that the positive work that you are doing now with regards to fundraising and raising awareness, it's through and aligned with the Samaritans, isn't it? How important have they been to you, and how important are they as a charity, and that actually people are able to pick up that phone if they are having a tough time, to be able to have somebody on the end of the phone who they can just talk to if they can't talk to somebody who is a close friend or close family member?
It's been incredibly important to me, and the personal support I've had from people in the Samaritans has been amazing. One of the directors, Sarah Ball, keeps in contact with me, and that support's been really, really helpful to me. She probably doesn't realise just how much of a difference it makes. When Gordon's friends and family and army colleagues ran various different Samaritons to finish the one that he'd signed up for, we raised, around about £20,000, and we'd got a letter from the senior director at the Samaritans, and that meant so much to us as a family. Yeah. So it does mean a lot to know that people care and people, are sharing. So, Gordon must have been on the Samaritans website to have seen the Samarathon in the first place. But, it almost appalls me that we've got this massive reliance on a charity run by volunteers, funded by donations, that's actually critical to saving lives. Again, we wouldn't do that for cancer. Can you imagine if you went to the doctor and said, well, I think you've got cancer, and you'd be like, oh right, well, when am I going to get surgery or treatment? And you'd be like, well, I think we've got a group that might be able to help you.
Here's this volunteer organisation.
And if they've got, they might be able to help you. You would be beside yourself. Well, I think I need surgery. Well, they might be able to do that, if you're lucky. Yeah. So, their need for donations, the cost of answering these calls is massive. That £20,000, they thought it was brilliant because that funded a day. And I couldn't believe it was only funding a day. And there's, not just the Samaritans, but other organisations as well. And also, I've done some, had some contact with some other little groups. There's a lot of groups setting up. There's one called Man On in Inverclyde, which I've had contact with, and they're doing fantastic work in just men supporting men and giving men a venue where they can talk openly about their struggles and their fears and their despair and their feelings of hopelessness and uselessness, but also have a laugh and do some boy stuff and enjoy that. And there's lots of groups like that, but it's not sufficient that we are so reliant on people just doing stuff off their own bat. That there needs to be more done. Yeah. For me this week, yes, I find birthdays, anniversaries, significant days, I find them very, very hard. So I need to have a coping strategy for them. And so I'm running the Samarathon in half the time I did last year. So I'm doing it over 6 days this year. And it gives me a focus that I've got to do 2 runs a day over this difficult week. It's given the family a focus because we're sharing the news of that. It's every step I pound the pavement with, I'm thinking this might help somebody else not have to do this. So the messages I get from people when they're donating and messages on social media, these really, really help me. Nothing takes the pain away, but all of the support from people is like scaffolding. It keeps me going. It keeps me upright. I'd say that to people. Don't ever underestimate what just a message to somebody saying, I'm really thinking of you. I'm really sorry. I really care. That can make a big difference. To know you've got that many people rooting for you and supporting you it is a huge help. Gets you through some very difficult days. My friends and my family here, are just there for me. And there's no words. Yeah. People are better not to try and, don't ever try and think you have to think of something that's going to make somebody feel better, because you can't. So a hug when we can hug, or
And
a
I think
word.
people are so terrified of saying the wrong thing, aren't they? That
They say the wrong
sometimes
thing,
they don't say
or
anything at
they
all
do
because
say the
actually
wrong thing.
they're worried about. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And I mean, what obviously the last sort of 18 months or so have been, difficult because of the pandemic for a lot of people. But we, before we were recording, we had an interesting conversation just about actually how that might, in some ways, actually help people to discuss mental health better, and actually how there may be some positive outcomes that come from the pandemic and from COVID-19.
yeah. I really do see that. I think that people, because the pandemic has impacted every single one of our lives in some way, it's therefore become very acceptable that we will be struggling to cope with whatever the impact in our life has been. And so it's almost giving permission to people to talk openly about their mental health without almost the sort of feeling guilty of, well, somebody's going to say, well, you've got a good job and a lovely family, and what have you got to feel depressed about? Look at people in worse circumstances. And that is a real thing for people to feel. So because almost the pandemic has given us a mechanism for opening up discussions about mental health. I think it's also, whilst there's lots of really, really negative things about it, but there's also the way in which it's given people a chance to reconsider what is good for them in their life and what's not good for them. I think society hundreds of years ago was a physically damaging environment. Lots of people worked in down mines and in mills, and there was things where so people's lives ended early because of physical illness and working in terrible physical environments. What I think we have created now is a society where we've got an environment that's very difficult mentally to cope with, and very stressful, and some people will find it very difficult. And so I think there's been an opportunity to actually say, well, maybe we don't need to do all these things, and maybe there are different ways we can live, and maybe we don't need so much money to spend, and maybe,
What are the important things in life?
yes.
What are the things, the friends, the family, the human contacts? What are the things that actually make us happy?
Because, although everybody's kind of like, well, it'd be nice to go to the cinema or go out for meals and things, actually what everybody missed was human contact, was being physically with their family and their friends and people very close to them. And so I think, there's some sort of rebalancing might come out of that, which I think would be a good thing.
And I in the sort of process of sort of researching for this interview, there is a phrase that I saw which really sort of stuck with me, which is suicide is preventable. It's not inevitable. If there is somebody who is listening, who is watching, who has heard this interview, and is either recognising some of those difficulties within a loved one, or is that loved one who is struggling at the moment, what would you say to them? What would be your I guess your one piece of advice that you would hope would be somebody's takeaway that might help them?
I think it's like my song, just reach out, and it can get better, but you have to get the help early. You have to speak to people. You have to be honest about what's going on inside yourself, and to recognise that people care about you, how you really are, and not just maybe the person you want to present to the world as being you. But phone the Samaritans or CAM or Shout or any of the agencies that are there. Go to the doctor. Tell everybody close to you that you are really struggling, because they can then help support you and get help themselves, because it is difficult to particularly to live with somebody that's going through that challenge. But just reach out early stage. If you wait too long or hope you will just get better or think you can get better by yourself, then you run the risk of it being too late. and you get to the point where you can't do anything any longer. And the pain and grief and devastation to anybody affected by a suicide is just unbearable. So, everybody matters and needs to get help if they're struggling. Don't listen to lies in your head. When you've got depression, your brain lies to you. Your mind will say you're no use to anybody, everybody will be better off without you, nobody's going to care anyway. That is lies. That is a mind that's not well telling you lies. One of the things that really helps me from being involved with Samaritans is when I hear the stories of people who have either attempted suicide or come close to it, but who are out there running this marathon because they know that life can get better. And that is the message. No matter how bad your life is or feels just now, with help and support, it can get better. And you have to believe that. Absolutely.
And just to end on, your sort of happy place that you have found now, and your real passion project for yourself that you've done. A lot has changed for you in the last couple of years, hasn't it? But your little bookshop that you've opened, and how how you've changed sort of so much within your own life since Gordon's death, but actually how you are now focusing on something really positive for you as well.
Yeah, I've got which I already had a sign up in my hallway that says you can't control the wind, but you can adjust the sails. And that's what I've had to do over the last 2 years is to adjust the sails, to make my life adjust to the storm that blew into it. And it has changed a lot. And I've previously had quite a high-pressured, high-profile, high-paid job. I travelled extensively. I worked long hours, and I worked very much in the online technology sector. And now I've fulfilled my lifelong dream and opened a little bookshop in the little town. Sitting in my home here, I can look out and see my bookshop, so my commute has gone to 2 minutes from thousands of miles.
Fantastic.
And rather than working in technology, which I'm still a fan of, I'm selling actual books. I love books. I love talking about books. I love the customers. I love the connection with the customers, and it is, as you said, it's a happy place to be. I'm close to all my family, so I had to make space in my life for this grief, because this grief won't ever go away any more than my love for my son will go away. So I've had to make some space for it. I've had to move things around so that I can accommodate it, because otherwise it would have crushed me. And so how I live my life is different now. And, I think I compare it to, and I was listening to one of your podcasts from the horribly injured ex-paratrooper.
Jacko Van Gogh.
But I think losing a child is a bit similar to somebody who's had limbs amputated, and they have to make adjustments in their life. They can go on and make their life as good as it can be. They can even do things that they would never have done before. They will never say they were glad it happened, or they wouldn't have preferred that it stayed. It's a life-changing injury, and losing your child is a life-changing loss. And I think, for anybody that's in the same situation, you have to be kind to yourself. You have to find the things that help you cope, which are different from the things that help me cope. But to try and accommodate it in your life and find a way of living with it, rather than trying to fight against it.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for talking to me today, for sharing your story and Gordon's story, and for speaking so honestly and openly about how you are coping and living with your grief. I really, really appreciate it, and very much hope that it helps, at least one person who's listened today.
I hope so too. And thank you for taking such an interest, Kaya, and and making such a connection with me.
Well, life is hard and gets you down. When pain and doubt will cast you out. When you can't find the words to say that you can't see another day. You are lost but can't be found. You are loved and needed here, and we can't help you fight your fears. No matter what, there is a way. Oh, I beg you, please just stay. Life is better when you're around. Just reach out and find someone who makes you want to stay. I know that it can't be done. I need you here with me. Yeah, I can cry 1,000 tears. I just want you to fight my dear, 'cause it gets better. It gets better. I know that it gets better. I know that it gets better. You feel a space no other can. Don't take your life, please understand. You leave a hole no tears can fill. I love you now and always will. Life is better when you're around. Just reach out and find someone who makes you want to stay. I know that it can't be done. I need you here with me. I can cry 1,000 tears. I just want you to find my dear, 'cause it gets better. It gets better. I know that 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 it gets better. Just reach out and find someone who makes you want to stay. I know that it can't be done. I need you here with me. And bit by bit, the weight will lift. The storm will pass and the weight will shift. 'Cause it gets better. It gets better. I know that it gets better.